The Starside Prophecy by Tirri. Read by the author. Chapter 6. The Eye. The Department of Planning resembled an elongated half-moon twisted at the centre and crowned with a revolving dome of glass known as the Observatory, which has long been regarded the finest feat of engineering in the local universe. With his head tilted back, Melchizedek was looking up at the millions of twinkling stars, vying for the attention of their creator. He then scanned the life-size marble statues exhibited throughout the observatory, all gifts of homage from his most talented and gifted. Donatello's David, posing nude with his boot pressing down on Goliath's severed head, which greeted visitors as they entered, was the only statue that tainted the overall purity of the hallowed space. Venus de Milo, with her arms intact, stood several feet to the right of David, and toward the middle of the room stood Hermes and the infant Dionysus. The most spectacular of all was a 20-foot ebony sculpture of Mary Magdalene, naked with her legs entwined around the waist of her naked lover and her hands wrapped around his neck. Melchizedek's personal contribution. Donatello had suggested that Mary's legs were not particularly lifelike because the skin was devoid of pores and hair, and Melchizedek should pay more attention to detail. Melchizedek laughed, suggesting to Donatello that David's penis was rather small and that he should pay more attention to the part of the statue the eye went to first. Melchizedek enjoyed animating his statues to take on the mannerisms of his guests. The trick was either received with laughter or gasps of incredulity, not so much for the feat itself, but the overt frivolity. Those who did not know Melchizedek well, and that was most, assumed he was serious and one-track minded, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Melchizedek loved to laugh, the prize attribute of his creations, and his actions were often laced with mischief, catching off guard those not expecting this kind of eccentricity. Melchizedek's organ, with its soaring pipes primed to produce an endless array of exquisite pitches, could be heard during the Easter and Christmas festivals. With the glass dome concertinaed back, vigorous renditions of the Psalms of King David swept around the square and then out into the countryside. Those drawn into the spell of the Godson's music were witness to celestial symphonies impossible to reproduce on earth. The enormous oyster table in the centre of the observatory was Melchizedek's most prized possession. He walked towards it and remembered when Sarah handed him a sketch on his birthday, the anniversary his soul had come into being. With gusto, Melchizedek had thrown himself into the project with the same level of craftsmanship his father had taught him during his apprenticeship in Nazareth. He then developed the sketch into a blueprint and then into the table where his hierarchy often gathered. Melchizedek ran his hands over the table, recalling the time several hundred years previously when he and Sarah had spent an entire vacation diving for shells in the ocean on the eastern shore of a small water planet another godson had breathed life into eons before. Melchizedek had instinctively known where to find the abandoned masterpieces. The oysters had vacated their homes long before the harvest was collected, and he and Sarah had stuffed their treasure into knapsacks like children. The curious marine creatures occupying the water had initially been reticent when he and Sarah had appeared from nowhere, but they had eventually offered themselves as transport to the shore. Melchizedek smiled. If only his human creations knew what an endless array of curious worlds awaited them. Melchizedek pulled out a chair and sat down. He was still absorbed in the memory of the time when he had bonded the mother-of-pearl shells to the table's heavy steel frame. Meticulous sanding, which had taken months, individual appliques endlessly polished to create a smooth, seamless veneer followed. The table, along with its dozen matching chairs, was the perfect gathering spot for visiting dignitaries who could not help but run their hands over the swirling creams and pinks and blues in the same way the godson liked to. A colossal section of plate glass shaped like an eye was positioned on the far side of the observatory so that Earth could be seen in amplification as it pursued its 24-hour rotation a mere 40,000 miles away. Melchizedek stood, tucking his chair under the table, and walked towards it. Standing several feet back with his feet set a foot apart and his arms folded across his chest, the godson began visualizing the individual vibratory patterns of his creations. Melchizedek liked to monitor the progress of each, from a water moccasin in the heart of the Florida Everglades to a financier on Wall Street. Melchizedek was not able to hear the thoughts of his creations, but was witness to the emotions their thoughts gave rise to, which appeared in their aura, the ever-changing colour spectrum that surrounded all sentient beings. Melchizedek redirected his focus and remained still and poised as he watched Sarah walk home from school. She was hungry because she hadn't eaten lunch that day, having spent all her lunch money on crisps in the tuck shop. She was cold and jaded and angry, causing her aura to remain steady grey, a luminous reflection of the 13-year-old's unhappy state of mind. "All is on course, all is well," said Melchizedek, responding to Sarah, who stopped and looked up at the heavens. Her fists were clenched, her eyes narrow, her expression steely. The longing for the life her mother had stripped from her was now an obsession. Melchizedek sent forth many words of encouragement, hoping that, despite the anti-force of her thinking mind, she might hear. It was a long shot because her thoughts were just a mass of spiteful judgments and prejudice. Knowing that his words would likely fall on deaf ears, but hopeful as always, Melchizedek prophesied an edict that all souls would eventually hear. "There will always be more power asking you to harness it. For now it is this. When you are tired of your mind running itself, you will learn to command it according to the authority of your will." Sarah stopped in her tracks, now unnerved as if someone was watching her. She looked around to see who it was, but no one was there. Sarah shook her head rapidly, as if to cast out an intrusive thought, and carried on walking. It was raining and the water gushed into the manhole running parallel to the curb. Sarah didn't have an umbrella and wasn't wearing a coat. As she turned the corner and entered the main high street, an old man with a strong Devonian accent snarled, "Watch where you're going." He was wearing a waxed anorak and carrying 2 heavy grocery bags that were stopping the circulation of blood to his fingers. The old man was a dairy farmer and took care of his wife who had suffered a stroke the previous year. He was irritable and tired, but the cows would need milking before he could rest. Sarah stepped out of the old man's way, and as he passed her, he muttered something under his breath about the youth of today. Melchizedek watched as Sarah moved out of the thoroughfare to stand under the awning of a hardware store. She looked shifty and acted as if someone was watching her. Sarah's eyes narrowed and she looked around suspiciously, as if she was being spied on from an upstairs window of a shop or from behind a chimney stack. Melchizedek noticed the colour change in Sarah's aura, as if a sudden recognition that something else was out there had occurred. This was a big but all too brief moment, and it fell away as quickly as it had arrived. Melchizedek continued to watch Sarah as she continued to watch everyone else around her. Melchizedek noticed Sarah noticing the pedestrians, the cyclists, and the mothers with pushchairs all making their way through the town, all preoccupied by some mental distraction, and so not noticing much about their immediate environment, let alone the lonely girl under the awning who was watching them. Melchizedek smiled, pleased with the fact that Sarah's critical awareness was developing. This was not true insight by any means, but a big step for a teenager with a troubled heart and mind. Melchizedek took his attention back to the other souls in the town. The treadmill of life was always repetitive for those who didn't know the basics of who they were, let alone who they were destined to become. The godson's compassion began to swell. The treadmill of life meant that by the end of the day, the clueless would be back in their homes, and at the end of the following day, back in their homes, and at the end of that day, back in their homes, and so it went on and on. Melchizedek noticed the car heading towards Sarah the exact moment she did, a pale 2-door boxy contraption built for invalid people hanging on to a bit of independence. The curd cambered deeply, and Sarah observed as the woman clumsily manoeuvred the car into the space reserved for those with handicaps. It took her ages to do what most could do with ease. The driver, a woman in her 70s wearing a surgical boot, climbed out of the car clutching an umbrella and a few empty plastic bags. Sarah turned away, revolted and annoyed. It was too depressing to watch. Tears of frustration began to trickle down her cheeks, bringing with them black mascara that she had layered on that morning. From his observatory, Melchizedek was not only able to see the reality of his creation's lives, but hear them when they spoke to him. Sarah was once again walking down the street, trying not to listen to the bells of St. Paul's, which were ringing as if they had some purpose. God's house, as the headmaster, Mr. Thomas, referred to it, was calling in the faithful. But most of the faithful were just scared of what might happen to them if they failed to keep up the pretense. As Sarah neared the church gate, she stopped and stood rigidly still. With contempt, she hissed loudly enough to be heard, "Come out here, you coward!" Several passers-by averted their eyes, wincing. The girl speaking to herself was embarrassing. Amused, but with empathy too, Melchizedek continued to watch as Sarah made her way further down the high street. Her aura was as grey and as dark as the combative thoughts she was unable to control. She was likely still having the same old internal arguments with the same old people about the same old things. This had been going on all day, sometimes about real conflicts that she wanted to change the ending to, and others just hypothetical scenarios that her thinking mind automatically and pointlessly liked to compute. The only time Sarah's mind was not alive with negativity was when she was listening to music, disco, punk and new wave. Melchizedek watched as Sarah stopped to look inside a shop window. He could tell she wanted to kick the glass in. She wanted to set off the fire extinguisher. She wanted to take the coins out the cash register and throw them into the fan. She wanted to wake people up, not hurt them but somehow cut them loose. From what? The slog of predictability? The shopkeeper held Sarah's gaze defiantly, just like his pudgy daughter Maxine, who went to the same school as Sarah. Maxine had deliberately splashed dirty water over Sarah in the girls' changing room that morning. Maxine was jealous of Sarah's appearance and the attention the boys gave her. Maxine was very aggressive, and so was her twin. There were a lot of twins in the farming town. When Sarah had mentioned this to her mother, all she had said was, "There's probably something wrong with the gene pool." Soaking wet and shivering, Sarah put the key in the lock and opened the door of the home she loathed. 1 Dow Street, Honiton, East Devon. Sarah often referred to it as 1 Foul Street. She walked by her brother, who was only a few feet from the TV, and made her way to the kitchen. Her mother was peeling potatoes at the sink and listening to Neil Diamond on the radio. Moving had not made her happy. Sarah plunked her satchel on the table and told her mother that she hated her life and asked if they could move back to Dorking where they belonged. Toughen up was all her mother had to say, but not with any venom. It was an instruction for life, a piece of motherly advice. Sarah's mother cut a large potato into quarters while her daughter went to the fridge to pour a glass of milk. "What time will dinner be ready?" "About 20 minutes. I'll bring it in on a tray." Seldom did this family sit around the table together. Sarah walked back into the living room. Her brother Mark was already watching Doctor Who and did not say anything to his sister because he had not noticed her. There was nothing much to say anyway. Mark was withdrawing into himself. He would eat and go to his bed to read, or he would watch the tropical fish swim in their aquarium on his dresser. He kept the aquarium light on at night. He did not like the dark or his new life. That morning, when Mark had woken up, his fish were on their sides, floating on the surface, all dead but one, which was still thrashing its fins in an attempt to get upright. Melchizedek heard Sarah comment under her breath earlier that day. "It doesn't take much for a diseased fish to drag all the others down with it." Mark had been very upset, the horror movie of his day already well underway, but their mother didn't know what to say. But then she never knew that comforting a child was part of what a loving mother did. She could have said, "Don't worry, baby, the fish are in heaven and doing just fine. You don't have to go to school today. I will help you bury them, and then we can clean the tank and find you some more. I promise you this will never happen again. Your mama will make sure of that." But Mark's mama didn't make sure of anything. She just shrugged and said, "Hurry up, you'll be late for school." Melchizedek could see Sarah sitting on the settee next to her brother staring at the TV, but neither were taking much in. Sarah was angry that her mother was so indifferent to their problems, but she also knew that her mother was too preoccupied with her own. It was only when her aura began to dance that Melchizedek knew that Sarah was consciously thinking thoughts of perseverance and resolve. She had vowed right there and then that she would never ignore her children. She would never filter them out or dismiss anything they thought was important. She would keep a close eye on them and make sure she not only listened but heard, really heard. As Sarah's aura changed from grey to purple, Melchizedek knew that something positive was taking place within her mind. A revelation perhaps, a vow or a new idea. Melchizedek smiled, glad that Sarah was thinking consciously. In that moment the elevator chimed, and Alusha stepped into the room and walked across the floor to greet the godson who was looking through the eye. They had plans to meet Cain at an Indian restaurant at Parish 16 called the Ashoka. Melchizedek turned around when he sensed Alusha enter his proximity and stepped towards her. They kissed on both cheeks. "You look lovely today." "Thank you." Alusha had changed out of her workwear and into a blazing orange sari. Whatever ethnic food she ate, she liked to wear the accompanying native dress. She always encouraged Cain and Melchizedek to do the same, but Cain was not always obliging. "How is Sarah doing?" Alusha recalled the last time she had seen her in the physical. The little girl had been 5 then, and Alusha's intention had been to infuse her with encouragement, but she ultimately felt that her visit had done more harm than good. For endless nights afterwards, Sarah had pined for the angel to come back, and when that hadn't happened, Sarah's disappointment in life had grown. "She's doing very well," said Melchizedek a little too affirmatively. "All is going according to plan, all is as it should be." Alusha knew what that meant, and she felt a fresh swell of compassion rise from within. Sarah had been gone for 13 years, and many of them fraught with difficulty. "Time for lunch," said Melchizedek, smiling. "Good," said Alusha, bringing her attention back to the present moment. "I was hoping you would say that." Alusha walked towards the plate glass window and looked eastward. Like the rest of the hierarchy, Alusha's eyesight was vastly superior to the mammalian eye of the human condition. The range of vertical, horizontal and peripheral vision was not exceptionable, but the dramatic range of distance was. The observatory offered 360-degree views of Starside. Alusha could see the structures 100 miles away in Parish 16 as clearly as if they were only several feet in front of her. The Ashoka didn't look too busy, and her favourite table had a vase of white and yellow frangipans on it. Alusha rejoined Melchizedek. He was now wearing a shawani, a long cream coat made from embroidered silk over matching fitted pants. "Ready?" he asked, offering Alusha his arm. "Yes, I'm ready, but I'm not sure you are. That is a very daring colour to be wearing when you're about to eat in a curry, my friend." The coat instantly changed from cream to saffron yellow. "Better?" "Yes."